The shuttle descended through thick green clouds and landed on a metal platform surrounded by endless jungle that stretched to every horizon. Like a living ocean of leaves and shadows and things that wanted to kill anything that moved. Instructor Velkith stood at the front of the landing platform with his arms crossed over his massive scaled chest and watched his 200 cadets filed out of the transport ships with wide eyes and trembling limbs. He was a Saurian warrior who had survived 30 years of combat across 12 star systems, and he had spent the last decade running this program because he believed that true warriors were forged in the fires of genuine danger and not in simulation chambers. Beside him stood Instructor Moreth, who clicked her 8 legs against the metal platform in a rhythm that betrayed her impatience with this new batch of soft academy students who had probably never experienced real fear in their comfortable lives. The cadets represented 37 different species from across the Galactic Union, and they ranged from the towering Crethani with their 4 arms and armored shells to the small quick Vomari, who could run faster than most ground vehicles, but bruised if you looked at them too hard. In the back row stood a single human female who was neither the tallest nor the strongest nor the fastest among the gathered cadets, and most of the other species gave her a wide berth, because everyone had heard strange stories about humans, but few actually believed them. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chun was 32 years old, and she had grown up in a small town in the Appalachian Mountains, where her grandfather had taught her to hunt deer and trap rabbits and read. The forest, like other children, learned to read books. She watched the instructors with calm brown eyes and noted the way Velkith positioned himself to appear larger and more threatening, and she recognized it immediately as a dominance display that humans had stopped needing about 50,000 years ago. "Welcome to Verdant 7, Velkith," announced in a voice that boomed across the platform and silenced the nervous chatter of the cadets. "This is a Class 4 death world, and for the next 14 rotations, it will be your home and your enemy and your teacher." Kethari cadet near the front raised one of her 4 hands and asked what made this planet a Class 4 death world, and Velkith smiled in a way that showed all of his razor-sharp teeth. "Everything here wants to eat you," he said simply. "The plants are poisonous, and the water hides ambush predators, and the forests are filled with pack hunters that have never encountered sentient prey and will find you absolutely delicious." Several cadets activated their emergency beacons right then and there and were escorted back to the shuttles in shame, while the others watched with a mixture of contempt and secret envy. Moreth stepped forward, and her mandibles clicked in what Sarah had learned was the Kethari equivalent of a condescending smile. "The rules of this examination are simple," she said. "You will be dropped at random locations across the northern continent, and you must survive for 14 rotations and reach the extraction point at coordinates that will be uploaded to your navigation implants." She paused and swept her compound eyes across the crowd of nervous cadets. "You will have no weapons and no technology beyond your navigation implants and emergency beacons, and you will have no contact with each other or with us unless you activate your beacon and accept failure." A tall Krethani cadet who had won several combat tournaments at the academy asked how they were supposed to survive without weapons against apex predators, and Moreth made a sound that was probably laughter. "You will not fight," she said firmly. "Fighting is death, and the predators here are faster and stronger and more numerous than you, and they have millions of years of evolution dedicated to killing things exactly like you." Velkith nodded and stepped forward again. "The key to survival is simple," he said. "Blend with nature and become invisible, and let the ecosystem flow around you without ever noticing that you exist, because you are not predators here, and you are not even prey." He pointed one clawed finger at the jungle beyond the platform. "You are visitors in a house that belongs to things far more dangerous than you, and your only hope is to pass through without disturbing the owners." Sarah Chen listened to this speech and felt something stir in her chest that might have been amusement, or might have been the first stirrings of what her grandfather had called the hunting instinct. She had heard this philosophy before from well-meaning people who thought that nature was something to be respected and feared and tiptoed around like a sleeping giant that might wake up angry. Her grandfather had taught her a different philosophy. He had taught her that humans had spent 200,000 years as persistent predators who chased their prey across open plains until the animals collapsed from exhaustion, and that humans had conquered every environment on Earth, not by hiding, but by adapting and innovating and refusing to accept that anything was more dangerous than them. She looked at the jungle with its towering trees and deep shadows and listened to the distant calls of things that probably wanted to eat her, and she did not feel fear. She felt something that her ancestors would have recognized immediately. She felt the ancient human urge to look at a hostile environment and think about how to make it less hostile and more useful, and ultimately how to make it belong to her. The cadets were divided into groups and loaded onto smaller shuttles that would drop them at their starting locations, and Sarah found herself seated next to a young Saurian named Rixton, who was trembling so hard that his scales rattled. "Are you afraid?" he asked her, and his voice was barely a whisper. Sarah considered the question carefully because she believed in honesty, even when it was complicated. "No," she said finally, "but I understand why you are, and there is no shame in fear because fear keeps you alive." Rixton looked at her with something like wonder in his reptilian eyes. "How can you not be afraid?" he asked. "Did you not hear the instructors, and do you not understand what is waiting for us down there?" Sarah smiled, and it was the smile of a woman whose great-great-grandmother had killed a bear with a sharpened stick and whose great-grandfather had survived 3 winters alone in the mountains after the collapse of civilization. "I heard them," she said, "but I think they are wrong about something important." "Wrong about what?" The shuttle began its descent, and Sarah watched the jungle grow larger through the viewport, and she thought about her grandfather and his lessons and the 200,000 years of survival knowledge encoded in her very DNA. "They said we are not predators here," she said quietly, "but humans are always predators everywhere, because that is what we evolved to be, and no amount of being dropped on an alien planet is going to change 200,000 years of instinct." The shuttle door opened, and the hot, wet air of the jungle rushed in, carrying scents of growth and decay and the distant musk of large animals. Sarah stepped out onto the forest floor and took a deep breath and felt the hunting instinct settle into her bones like an old friend coming home. The instructors had told her to blend with nature. She had a different plan. By the 3rd rotation, 17 cadets had already pressed their emergency beacons and been extracted from the jungle in states ranging from mild dehydration to severe psychological trauma. The Valkyrie pack hunters had claimed 4 cadets who had made the mistake of sleeping on the ground, where their body heat created easy targets for the heat-sensing predators that ruled the night. The swamp regions had taken another 6 cadets who had not understood that the still waters hate creatures with jaws strong enough to bite through starship hull plating and patience measured in days rather than hours. The remaining cadets moved through the jungle in scattered groups of 2 or 3 because the instructors had forbidden communication. But they had not forbidden proximity, and there was comfort in knowing that something else might get eaten first. They did exactly what they had been taught, and they hid in trees during the day and burrowed into mud at night and covered themselves with local plants to mask their scent, and they ran from every sound and flinched at every shadow. They were surviving, but they were not living, and the constant fear was wearing them down faster than hunger or thirst ever could. Nobody knew where the human had gone. Sarah Chun had been dropped in a dense section of forest near a river, and her tracking beacon had shown her moving steadily for the first 6 hours, and then it had simply stopped in one location and stayed there. The instructors assumed she had found a good hiding spot and was doing exactly what she had been taught. They were wrong on the first day. Sarah had found a suitable tree with thick branches and good sight lines, and she had climbed it and spent 4 hours simply watching the forest and learning its rhythms and patterns. She watched the small creatures that moved through the underbrush and noted which plants they avoided and which paths they preferred, and she watched the medium-sized predators that hunted the small creatures and learned their schedules and territories. She watched the Valkyrie pack hunters move through the forest like shadows made of muscle and teeth, and she counted their numbers and memorized their patrol routes and studied the way they communicated with each other through clicks and growls. By the end of the first day, she understood the ecosystem better than most xenobiologists would have after a month of study. On the second day, she began to work. She found a rocky outcropping near the river where the ground was hard enough to hold weight, and she spent 3 hours searching for the right stones and testing them against each other until she found ones that would chip into sharp edges when struck correctly. Her grandfather had taught her this when she was 12 years old, and her hands remembered the motions, even though her mind had to translate them into working with alien materials. By sunset, she had a knife and a hand axe and the beginnings of a speararm. Third day, the Valkyrie found her scent trail. A pack of 6 hunters picked up her trace near the river and began tracking her with the patient confidence of apex predators who had never encountered anything on this world that could threaten them. They found her camp at midday when most predators would be resting, and they spread out in a classic encirclement pattern that had worked for their species for millions of years. The alpha male moved forward first with his 400 kilograms of muscle and claw, ready to make the kill quick and clean. He stepped on a patch of ground that looked exactly like every other patch of ground, and the carefully balanced boulder that Sarah had spent 6 hours positioning crashed down on his skull. With a wet crunch that echoed through the forest, the other 5 hunters froze in confusion because nothing in their evolutionary history had prepared them for the concept of a trap. Sarah dropped from the tree above them with her stone spear aimed at the second largest hunter, and her weight drove the sharpened point through the thick hide and into the vital organs beneath. The hunter was dead before it hit the ground, and Sarah was already rolling away and coming up with her hand axe ready. The remaining 4 hunters should have fled because they had never experienced anything like this, and their instincts were screaming that something was deeply wrong. But they were apex predators, and apex predators did not run from prey. 2 more died in the next 30 seconds, and the last 2 finally broke and ran into the forest with their tails between their legs and fear scent marking every step of their retreat. Sarah stood in the clearing surrounded by 4 dead apex predators, and she was breathing hard, but she was not injured and she was not afraid. She was exhilarated. She spent the rest of the day processing her kills and taking what she needed. She took the pelts because they would provide warmth and camouflage and intimidation. She took the claws because they would make excellent weapon tips and tools. She took the skulls because her grandfather had taught her that there was power in symbols, and the predators understood the language of death better than any other language. By the time darkness fell, she had arranged her trophies in a pattern around her camp that any intelligent predator would recognize as a warning. This territory is claimed, and the thing that claimed it killed 4 of your kind in less than a minute. On the 4th day, a young Saurian cadet named Rixton stumbled into a clearing and found the display that Sarah had created. He saw the Alpha Valkyrie hanging from vines with its throat cut and its pelt removed. He saw the skulls arranged in a pattern that spoke of deliberate intent and intelligence, and something that his species had not felt in 10,000 years of galactic civilization. He felt prey fear. His emergency beacon was active before he even realized his hand had moved, and when the extraction shuttle arrived, he could barely speak, but he managed to convey one crucial piece of information to the instructors. "The human is not hiding," he whispered. "The human is hunting, and she is winning." Instructor Velkith listened to the report and felt something he had not experienced in 30 years of combat across 12 star systems. He felt the first cold touch of genuine uncertainty about how this examination was going to end. Instructor Velkith had supervised 200 survival examinations on Verdant 7, and in all that time, he had never once ordered a mid-course investigation. The examination was designed to test cadets without interference, and the instructors were supposed to observe from orbit and only intervene when emergency beacons were activated. But the report from Cadet Rixton had disturbed him in ways he could not fully articulate, and he found himself authorizing a drone survey of the humans' position before he had consciously decided to do so. Instructor Morath stood beside him in the observation deck as the first images began streaming in from the reconnaissance drones, and for several minutes, neither of them spoke. The footage showed a small clearing near a river where a crude but effective shelter had been constructed from branches and leaves and animal hides. Around the shelter, in a radius of approximately 50 meters, there were things that made Velketh's scales tighten against his body in an involuntary fear response. Skulls mounted on sharpened stakes formed a perimeter around the camp. Pelts had been stretched on wooden frames and positioned to catch the wind so that they moved constantly like restless ghosts. The bodies of dead predators had been arranged in poses that somehow conveyed both warning and contempt, as if the killer was not afraid of attracting scavengers, but was actively inviting them to try their luck. Run the thermal analysis, Velketh ordered, and his voice was steady, but his hearts were beating faster than they should. The drone's sensors swept the area and reported something that should have been impossible. There were no large predators within 500 meters of the humans' camp. The Velkari pack hunters who normally patrolled this territory had completely abandoned it, and their new patrol routes curved around the humans' position like water flowing around a stone. The swamp ambush predators had retreated to the deeper waters. Even the small opportunistic scavengers that normally infested every corner of the jungle were absent from the immediate area. She has not just survived, Morath said slowly, and her mandibles clicked in a pattern that indicated deep unease. She has established territorial dominance over an apex predator species in less than 4 rotations. Velkith ordered the drones to reconstruct the events of the past few days using their recorded footage, and what they found made him question everything he thought he knew about humans. The first trap had been the deadfall that killed the Alpha. Velkari and the engineering analysis revealed a sophisticated understanding of physics and leverage that should have been impossible for someone working with only natural materials. The boulder that had crushed the Alpha's skull weighed approximately 300 kilograms, and the human weighed perhaps 60 kilograms, and yet she had positioned it perfectly using nothing but wooden levers and vine ropes and patience. The second trap was a pit filled with sharpened stakes, and it was disguised so effectively that even the drone's thermal sensors had difficulty detecting it until they knew exactly where to look. The human had spent approximately 8 hours digging the pit, and another 4 hours sharpening the stakes, and another 6 hours camouflaging the opening. And she had done all of this while simultaneously monitoring the local predator movements and avoiding detection. The third kill had not been a trap at all. The footage showed the human climbing a tree and positioning herself on a branch directly above a game trail, and then simply waiting. She had remained motionless for 9 hours in a position that would have caused most species to cramp and fail within 30 minutes when a Velkari hunter had finally passed beneath her tree. She had dropped onto its back with a sharpened stone blade and ended its life in less than 2 seconds. That is not possible, Morath said, and her voice was barely a whisper. No species can remain motionless for that long, and the physical strain alone should have been incapacitating. Velkith pulled up the human species file and began reading with new eyes. He read about persistence predation and how ancient humans had hunted by simply following their prey for days until the animals collapsed from exhaustion. He read about the human capacity for delayed gratification and how they could suppress immediate needs for hours or days in pursuit of a larger goal. He read about their pattern recognition abilities and their capacity for environmental manipulation and their strange tendency to form emotional bonds with other species and then lead those species in coordinated group activities. He read about their history of warfare and genocide and colonization, and he read about their history of cooperation and sacrifice and love. They are insane, he said finally. Their species is fundamentally psychologically unstable, and they oscillate between extreme violence and extreme compassion with no apparent pattern or logic. Morith had been running her own analysis, and what she found was even more disturbing. The decorations around her camp. She said, the skulls and the pelts and the arranged bodies, and all of it is not random, and is not simply practical. What do you mean? It is psychological warfare. Morith said, she is not just killing predators, and she is sending a message to the entire ecosystem, and the message is very clear. She pulled up a comparative analysis of the humans' camp decorations and cross-referenced them with anthropological databases from Earth's pre-spaceflight era. Human tribes used to do this to each other, she said. They would display the remains of defeated enemies to intimidate rivals and establish dominance, and she's doing the same thing here, but her enemies are not other humans. Her enemies are the apex predators of a Class 4 Death World. Velkith finished. They stood in silence for a long moment and watched the drone footage of the humans sitting peacefully by her fire and cooking meat from her latest kill, while the jungle around her remained silent and empty and afraid. The classification system, Velkith said finally. Humans are listed as Class 2 endurance predators with moderate threat level, and I think that classification may need to be revised. I agree, Morith said. I am formally recommending that humans be reclassified as Class 5 adaptive apex predators with extreme threat level. There is no Class 5 category. Then we will need to create one. The drone footage continued streaming in, and it showed the human finishing her meal and banking her fire and settling down to sleep in a camp that no predator on the planet would dare approach. She slept peacefully and deeply while all around her the forest held its breath and waited for the terrifying newcomer to decide what she would hunt tomorrow. Word spread through the remaining cadets like fire through dry grass. Even though they had no communication devices and were supposed to be isolated from each other, the jungle had its own ways of passing information, and the cadets who survived long enough learned to read those ways. They noticed that the Velkari packs had changed their patrol patterns and were avoiding certain areas entirely. They noticed that the night sounds of hunting and killing had grown quieter in some parts of the forest. They noticed the strange silence that had fallen over the northwestern sector where the human had been dropped. And they noticed the rumors that spread from cadet to cadet whenever two or more of them happened to cross paths. The human is not hiding, the human is hunting. The human has killed more apex predators in 4 days than the rest of us have seen in 10. Kelmari was a young insectoid from a prey species that had evolved on a gentle world where the most dangerous animal was roughly equivalent to an earth rabbit. Her people had never developed hunting instincts because they had never needed them, and they had never developed fighting instincts for the same reason. She had joined the Galactic Academy because she wanted to prove that her species could contribute to galactic civilization in ways beyond just farming and manufacturing. She had not expected to be dropped on a Class 4 death world and told to survive for 2 weeks. By the 6th day, she had not slept in 40 hours, and her chitin was cracked from multiple falls, and her energy reserves were so depleted that she could barely keep moving. But she kept moving because the alternative was dying, and Kelmari had decided somewhere around hour 30 that she was not going to die on this horrible planet. The pack hunters found her on the 7th day. There were 5 of them, and they had been driven from their normal hunting grounds by something that scared them more than hunger, and they were desperate and angry. and looking for easy prey, Kalmari saw them emerge from the undergrowth, and she felt her legs give out beneath her as the last of her energy reserves finally failed. She collapsed against a cliff face and watched the hunters spread out in their encirclement pattern, and she thought about her family back home and wondered if they would ever know what happened to her. The alpha hunter moved forward with its jaws open and saliva dripping from teeth that were longer than her fingers, and then it stopped. The sound came from somewhere in the trees above and behind the pack hunters, and it was not a scream or a roar or any noise that Kalmari could identify. It was a whistle, 3 short notes in a pattern that sounded almost cheerful. The pack hunters spun around, and Kalmari saw something she would remember for the rest of her very long life. A human woman walked out of the forest like she owned it. She was wearing the pelt of an alpha Valkyrie draped over her shoulders like a cloak, and she was carrying a spear in one hand and a stone axe in the other, and she was covered in mud and dried blood, and she was smiling. The pack hunters looked at her, and then they looked at each other, and then they did something that Kalmari would not have believed possible if she had not seen it with her own compound eyes. They ran. 5 apex predators turned tail and fled into the jungle like frightened prey animals, and they did not look back, and they did not slow down until they were far, far away. The human woman watched them go, and then she turned to Kalmari, and her smile softened into something that looked almost gentle. "Are you injured?" she asked. Kalmari tried to respond, but her translator implant was malfunctioning from lack of power, and all that came out was a series of clicks that probably meant nothing to a human. The woman seemed to understand anyway. She crouched beside Kalmari and pulled out a crude container made from animal bladder and offered it. "Water," she said. "Drink slowly, and you will feel better soon." Kalmari drank, and the water was warm and tasted slightly of animal, but it was the most wonderful thing she had ever experienced. "You saved me," she managed to say once. Her translator started working again. "Why would you save me when the examination is individual scoring?" The human woman sat down beside her and looked out at the forest with an expression that Kalmari could not read. "My name is Sarah," she said, "and I saved you because that is what my people do." "I do not understand." Sarah was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke again, her voice was different and softer and older somehow. "My species spent 200,000 years as predators," she said. "But before that we were prey, and we remember what it was like to be hunted and to be afraid, and to know that something bigger and stronger wanted to kill us." She gestured at the forest around them. "My ancestors survived because they learned to fight back, and they learned to hunt the hunters, and they learned to make tools and traps and weapons that let them compete with things that should have killed them easily. But they also survived because they worked together," she continued. "They formed tribes and families and communities, and they protected each other, even when it would have been easier to run away alone." Kalmari listened and felt something shifting in her understanding of humans. "You could have left me," she said. "The predators were focused on me, and you could have escaped." Sarah shook her head. "That is not how humans think," she said. "When we see someone in danger, our first instinct is to help, and it is not always logical, and sometimes it gets us killed. But it is who we are." She stood up and offered Kalmari a hand. "My camp is about 2 hours from here," she said. "Nothing comes within half a kilometer anymore, because they have learned that my territory means death, and you can rest there and eat real food and recover your strength." "And then what?" "And then I will help you get to the extraction point," Sarah said, "because you are one of my classmates, and that makes you part of my pack, and I protect my pack." Kalmari took the offered hand and let the human pull her to her feet. They walked through the forest together, and Kalmari noticed how the jungle grew quieter around them, and how the shadows seemed to pull back, and how even the insects stopped their constant buzzing when Sarah passed. She had been taught that humans were dangerous, and that their unpredictable nature made them unsuitable for most galactic roles. Now she understood that humans were dangerous, but not in the way she had feared. They were dangerous to anything that threatened the people they had decided to protect. When they reached Sarah's camp, Calamari found two other cadets already there, and both of them were recovering from their own near-death experiences, and both of them looked at Sarah with something that was equal parts fear and worship. "Welcome to base camp," Sarah said. "Rest and eat, and tomorrow we will start planning how to get all of you to the extraction point alive." Calamari settled down by the fire and watched the human woman who had killed apex predators with stone tools and intimidated an entire ecosystem into submission, and then walked into danger to save a stranger because it was the right thing to do. She thought about what it would mean for the galaxy if more species learned to think like humans, and she thought about what it would mean for her own people if they had a human as an ally instead of a competitor. It was a thought worth pursuing. The extraction shuttle descended through the green clouds of Verdant 7 on the 15th day and found something waiting at the designated coordinates that made the pilot request confirmation 3 times before believing his sensors. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chun stood at the center of the landing zone with perfect military posture, despite being covered in mud and blood and wearing a cloak made from the pelt of an apex predator. Behind her stood 31 cadets. Every single survivor of the examination had gathered at the extraction point together, and they were not huddled or frightened or desperate. They were standing in formation. Several of them were wearing crude armor fashioned from predator hide and carrying weapons made from stone and bone and wood, and they looked less like academy cadets who had barely survived a nightmare and more like warriors who had conquered one. The jungle around the landing zone was completely silent. No animal calls and no insect buzzing, and no movement in the underbrush, and the forest itself seemed to be holding its breath as if waiting for the terrifying creatures at its center to finally leave. Instructor Velkith walked down the shuttle ramp and stopped 10 meters from the human, and for a long moment, he simply stared. He had been a warrior for 30 years, and he had seen things that would break most minds, and he had killed enemies that most species considered unkillable, but he had never seen anything quite like this. "Lieutenant Commander Chun," he said, and his voice was carefully controlled. "Explain what I am seeing." Sarah snapped to attention with crisp precision that somehow made her primitive appearance look more impressive rather than less. "Sir, I completed the survival examination as instructed, and I reached the extraction point within the designated time frame, and I am ready to return to the academy." "And the 31 cadets standing behind you, they also completed the examination?" "Sir, and they also reached the extraction point, and they are also ready to return to the academy." Velkith felt one of his eyes twitch. The examination rules specified that cadets were not to communicate or cooperate with each other, and each cadet was to be scored individually. "With respect, sir, I reviewed the examination rules carefully before the drop, and they prohibited communication devices, and they prohibited coordinated starting positions, but they did not prohibit cooperation that occurred naturally during the course of the examination." Sarah's expression did not change, but Velkith could have sworn he saw something like amusement in her eyes. "I encountered other cadets who were in distress, and I rendered assistance as any officer would be expected to do, and when they had recovered, I invited them to accompany me to the extraction point for their own safety." "You invited 31 cadets to accompany you?" "Yes, sir, and I encountered 43 cadets in total. But 12 of them had already activated their emergency beacons before I could reach them." Instructor Morath descended the ramp, and her 8 legs clicked against the metal in a rhythm that indicated extreme agitation. "You were supposed to survive, despite the environment," she said. "The entire purpose of this examination was to teach cadets that they cannot fight a Solista Class 4 death world, and that their only hope is to hide and evade and wait." Sarah turned to face the Keth-Ari instructor, and something in her posture shifted. She was no longer a cadet being debriefed. She was a predator, explaining something to a creature that had never understood what predators actually were. With respect, ma'am, that approach works for species that evolved as prey, and it works for species that developed intelligence to escape predation, and it probably works for 90% of the galaxy." She paused. "But it does not work for humans." "Explain." Sarah gestured at the silent forest around them. "My ancestors did not survive by hiding from predators, and they did not survive by avoiding dangerous environments, and they survived by looking at every threat and every challenge and every obstacle and asking themselves one question. What question? How do I kill it?" The words hung in the air, and several of the cadets behind Sarah shifted uncomfortably, but none of them stepped back and none of them looked away. Humans spread across our entire planet in less than 100,000 years. Sarah continued. "We colonized every environment from frozen tundras to burning deserts to dense jungles, and we did not do this by blending in or hiding or waiting for the danger to pass. We did it by adapting and innovating and fighting and winning." She pointed at the forest. "You told me that I was not an apex predator here, and you told me that my only hope was to become invisible, and you told me that the ecosystem would destroy me if I tried to fight it. You were wrong." Velketh looked at the silent forest, and he looked at the 31 cadets who had survived because one human had decided that hiding was not acceptable, and he looked at the human herself, who had conquered a Class 4 death world in 2 weeks with nothing but rocks and sticks and 200,000 years of predator instinct. "The survival examination curriculum," he said slowly, "it has been used for 300 years, and it had been considered the gold standard for training elite operatives. I am recommending that it be completely revised." Marth made a sound that might have been agreement or might have been despair. "What would you recommend instead?" Velketh looked at Sarah Chun. "I am recommending that human survival methodology be added as a mandatory course for all tactical and command track cadets, and I am recommending that Lieutenant Commander Chun be offered a position as instructor." Sarah blinked, and for the first time since the shuttle had landed, she looked genuinely surprised. "Sir, you have demonstrated capabilities that our classification systems did not account for, and you have achieved results that our best analysts considered impossible, and you have done so while simultaneously protecting and leading 31 cadets from 30 different species." He straightened to his full height. "The galaxy needs to learn what humans already know, and you are going to teach them." 3 years later, the Galactic Academy's most popular elective was no longer Advanced Diplomacy or Starship Tactics. It was Introduction to Human Survival Psychology. Commander Sarah Chun stood at the front of a lecture hall filled with cadets from 100 different species, and she smiled. The same smile she had worn when she walked out of that jungle, wearing a predator's pelt and carrying weapons made from stone. "The galaxy is full of things that want to kill you," she said, "and most species have spent their entire evolutionary history learning to hide from those things and evade them and survive despite them." She paused and let the words sink in. "Humans learned something different, and today I am going to teach you what we learned." She pulled up a holographic image of Earth and zoomed in on the African savanna where her species had first emerged. "Everything is afraid of something," she said. "Your job is not to be less visible or less detectable or less present. Your job is to become the thing that everything else is afraid of." The cadets leaned forward in their seats, and Commander Sarah Chun began to teach them how to be human.